Thank you for joining us this week for our discussion. Imagine a time in America when the United States is pulling away from world affairs, preferring not to get involved in other parts of the world. Imagine a time when the economy seems to be going well for some, but maybe not so well for others. Imagine a time when racists are comfortable espousing their views in public with no fear of public recrimination. And imagine a time when science and religion are at conflict, with traditional religious values coming into conflict with newer scientific ideas and principles. That time is the 1920s in the United States of America. Our topic for this week: the 20s is a complicated time period, and we're going to break this lecture into two different sections. First, more about life in the 20s, the second half, about the political environment during the decade. So, to begin, as we've done before, take a look at some of these popular names. We did this maybe in the 1890, I believe, 3 lectures ago. So, got some new names on there, some classic names that are still there. Kind of neat to see. It'll be especially interesting to see as we move forward even further into the 50s and so how things proceed. So, changing life in the 1920s. Life was dramatically different during the 20s than it even had been in the 19 teens. Just a short time frame, the United States changed significantly. First, people were becoming more and more urbanized. During the decade, 2 million people per year moved from the country to cities. Cities are growing tremendously. Take a look at this chart, and what do you see happening in 1920? If you look closely at both axes, you'll see that during this year, this is the first time that more people live in cities than live in urban environments, or excuse me, that live in urban environments rather than rural environments. So think about that. What change might that mean for the United States, that it's now a more urbanized society than it is a rural society? For how much of American history, right? 150 years, America had been mainly agrarian. Now we're becoming mainly urban. That'll fuel some of the changes during this time frame. One of the biggest changes that we know about and we talked about earlier was the movement for prohibition. Prohibitionists were successful when the 18th Amendment was passed. I want you to take a look, please, at the text of the 18th Amendment and look for the verbs. What is banned and what is not banned? Take a second and look at this. This is really interesting, and it'll tell us a lot about why prohibition was ultimately doomed to failure. If you look, you'll see that it is illegal to manufacture, to sell, or to transport alcoholic beverages, either inside the US or from other places. But what's not listed in there? Consumption, right? Consumption isn't listed. So think about that for a second. Can this be successful if people are still allowed to possess and to consume the thing that's being banned? Kind of makes you wonder. There are so many ways around prohibition too that it's really not surprising that it failed. Here's a few of them. So first off, it was not illegal to make wine, cider, or beer at home. It was only illegal to distill hard liquor. So people would still have the means to produce it themselves. Going back to the First Amendment, right? Freedom of religion. Alcohol cannot be banned in a religious context, so religious wine was still allowed. There's a great documentary from Ken Burns a few years ago, probably about 10 years ago, and they had this great story in there about how the number of rabbi applications increased. I guess it was easier to say that you were a rabbi and could have access to religious wine than it would be to say you were a priest. And so there were a significant number of Irish and African American rabbis that started applying for their religious exemption license in the 1920s. That's kind of interesting. And then you could, of course, just leave the country. People on the northern border went to Canada. People on the southern border went to the United States. And interestingly, Florida, its neighbor, the Bahamas, was owned by the United Kingdom. And so people could simply leave the country um, to get their alcohol. The Bahamas are really interesting. Today we think of it as a great tourist destination, but at this time the Bahamas were largely undeveloped. There wasn't good electricity, good plumbing, just the infrastructure was not there. It was really American money, people that went to the Bahamas to drink, that fueled the development of the Bahamas. And finally, here's one last way around it. If you take a look at the image on the screen, what do you see there? It's harder to see on the right side, but on the left on the receipt, you can see this was a prescription pad where a doctor could prescribe you alcohol as well. So again, it seems like there's so many ways around it that it's not really surprising that prohibition will fail. This is the time frame if you're into gangster movies when you hear about speakeasies, right? Those are the places where you had to know the secret password to get in to drink alcohol. People would also still make, we said it was illegal, but they would bootleg liquor. So they would make it mainly throughout the South. Interestingly, NASCAR is developed by rum runners, people who are trying to outrun the police by souping up their cars to be faster than stock police cars. And then, like we said, gangsters, organized crime increased dramatically. Al Capone was earning $60 million a year during this time frame. So I think this really goes to show that if people really want something, they're still going to find a way to get it, right? Going back to the idea of medicinal liquor, check this out. Walgreens started as a small store chain, but quickly developed. If you read The Great Gatsby, it's not a Walgreens, but Gatsby talks about he made his money from drugstores. It's not selling medicine that we're thinking of. It was really the sale of alcohol where Gatsby got his money in The Great Gatsby. The large borders of the United States make it impossible to enforce. Think of the Canadian border, the border with Mexico, right? People could just drive across and get it. On the coasts, other people would wait until right before high tide and they would dump stuff in barrels at sea, and then overnight people would go retrieve it from the beach as the high tide brought it in. States themselves aren't even interested in enforcing this, and so what we see is the eventual movement for a repeal of prohibition. We're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but that end will come when? What happens after the 1920s? The Great Depression, right? One thing that the U.S. government makes a lot of money on is our taxes on alcohol. So the Great Depression will probably be the final nail in the coffin, and the 21st Amendment will repeal the 18th. An easy way to remember those two amendments, right? You think of big milestone birthdays in your life, 18 and 21. So 18 was what enacted prohibition. The 21st repealed it. The 18th Amendment is the only amendment to the Constitution that's ever been completely repealed. Okay, so let's switch gears and talk about just some changing ideas. We mentioned in the intro about science and religion. So fundamentalism versus science, right? A strict interpretation of the Bible versus more modern ideas that had been going on for 20, 30, 40 years. What's the one big issue that we think of in science and biology, perhaps, where people might differ from those two camps? That would be evolution, right? So this comes to a head in Tennessee, where a high school biology teacher named John Scopes is teaching biology. He kind of knew that he wanted to be the test case for this eventual trial of evolution. And so Scopes goes ahead and he teaches evolution despite the fact that Tennessee banned it. So he's arrested and he's charged with violating the state ban on teaching evolution. His trial will really be the first big trial of the century. And there will be two famous attorneys on each side. Clarence Darrow was a famous American lawyer, nationally known. The special prosecuting attorney was William Jennings Bryan. If you remember, we talked about him with populism. He had run for president a few times. He had served in the cabinet of another president. So he'll represent the fundamentalist side. And again, this trial will attract such large crowds that they eventually move it outside because so many people wanted to see it. We're going to talk about some other changes, such as the radio, which will mean this will be a trial that people can literally tune into on the radio as well. We have a few images here of the trial. The Pied Piper, that's the legend of the Pied Piper who's able to take the rats out of the kingdom, and the king refuses to pay him. So then the Pied Piper takes the children out of the kingdom. So it's this older fairy tale. It's actually kind of dark. But this political cartoonist is saying, right, that the teaching of evolution will lead children down this dark path. You see the cave where it talks about disbelief in God. The New York Times also covered the trial. So here we see the evolution trial. And although Scopes was the person on trial, and it's often called the Scopes trial, another name you hear it as is the monkey trial, right? Because people are saying the fact that perhaps people descended from great apes millions and millions of years ago, right, really garners people's attention. Scopes is convicted. He's fined $100. His guilt wasn't really up for debate. The law said, don't teach evolution. He did. But this trial, right, really shows the conflict in American society at the time. Will these new scientific theories clash with these older religious views? Let's talk briefly about the 1920s and the 1920s woman. So we've all probably seen an image of a flapper before. Maybe some of y'all have gone to a costume party for Halloween as a flapper. But flappers were a new style, not just a style of fashion, but a new lifestyle for young women in the 1920s. And they're doing some things that were considered fairly risque and scandalous at the time. So we see in this image here, first off, dresses that were at or above the knee. So they were already showing much more flesh than their mothers would, or even than their more reserved peers of their own age would. Their dresses are not fitted, they're waistless so that they would move when they're dancing in public. This is the jazz age, so we'll talk about, right, dance later on that really accentuates movement. Flappers often cut their hair short, and they also dyed it dark, so you'd see kind of these pin curls. And then, perhaps most scandalous of all to the general public or to people who didn't like them, who judged them, was the fact that they would go in public and do things that women before were not allowed to do, or was considered terrible for women to do. So they would smoke in public, they would drink in public, and they would go dancing at nightclubs in public with men. This is stuff that didn't happen. If you think of the 1800s, right, you picture neither women nor men really going out to date, right? It's just the guy kind of showed up at the house and maybe they sat on the porch for an hour and talked, and that was their whole courtship, right? The 1920s will be a time of saying, maybe we want to do this a little differently. Another large area where we see change is in the workforce. Women are first, like we learned last week, having factory jobs from World War I and taking over a new role. But as the war ends and men return home from war, women and also African Americans who had gone to work in factories to support the war effort are displaced and either returning home or looking for new jobs. Women benefit from some of the newer technologies such as typewriters. Telephones have been around for a while, but jobs as switchboard operators continue. Women really for the first time are able to have a spot in the professional workplace. However, these jobs, they're not going to become the managers, the top wage earners, but they are getting a foothold for the very first time in a professional office type environment. Families change as well, too. If you think about the birth rate of a nation, so we said earlier that the United States was moving from more rural to more urban. So what might happen to the birth rate as society urbanizes? Well, it's going to decline. When you're on the farm, the more hands you have, right, the more help you have. But when you're in a city, the more children you have is going to mean more mouths to feed, a bigger apartment to live in, right? So there'll be a decline based on where people are living and what they have to offer to or to take care of a child. But there's also increased information about birth control by people like Margaret Sanger that will help to uh, lower the birth rate. Homes in the United States change as well. This is really a consumer society. So check this out. Here we have, it says electric washer there in the top right. This is a washing machine for your clothes. You notice, however, it's not really its own appliance in its own separate laundry room. This is something that you would wheel into the kitchen and have next to your kitchen sink. That way you have access to plumbing. Refrigerators came about really during this time period and became common in people's homes as they moved away from ice boxes to refrigerators. And this one's just kind of fun. There you go. There's a waffle maker. So think about life without those things. People's lives change. Marriages, like we said, women going out, couples themselves, they decided that they wanted to date more. And so you have marriages based more on love. Aw. People focused on raising children and raising a family because of the decline of child labor. Also, with the decline of child labor, right, we know that children will be in school most of the day and no longer working. So those are some changes just to the typical family life of people at the time. Let's look at a few other changes. One is education. During this time frame, America is becoming more and more literate. The number of high school students, states requiring a high school education, is increasing. And as people start to read more, they'll want more things to read. So you get the idea of really like magazines becoming a thing for the first time. There's no longer just the newspaper as something inexpensive to read, but magazines become a way for America to whet its appetite. The radio becomes present in homes as well for the first time. So people can, we think radio maybe is music today, but they can listen to a whole host of things. There's comedies. These are radio dramas, right? Today we might think of them as podcasts, but there's dramas. There's comedies. There's news. Of course, there's music, right? There's variety shows where a host, kind of like Jimmy Fallon or Jimmy Kimmel today, has a bunch of guests that come on. People can also hear for the first time. Think about how trippy this would be. They could hear the president's voice. If you lived before the radio, the only way you heard the president's voice was seeing him talk in person, right? Now you could hear that on the radio. If you were the fan of a sports team, the only way you could participate live is to actually go to the stadium, right? To see your favorite baseball team play. But now people can tune in and listen. That's also going to, if you think about it, broaden the fan base, right? If you lived in St. Louis, Missouri, you could go see the Cardinals in person. But if you lived 200 miles away in Missouri, if you lived in Arkansas, if you lived in Iowa, all of a sudden you could hear and follow along with your favorite team, not just reading about it in the newspaper, but listening to it live. Think about where we would be without live access to information. Movies also become commonplace. They become accessible to people during this time frame. Television is still not going to be around really until the late 1950s. So the only way you could see movies was to go to a movie theater. We have a few of the firsts here. These are on YouTube. You can find them in different places, but movie technology is going to rapidly change. There are several different writers, some classics that maybe are still required reading in high school and early college lit classes. Sinclair Lewis will write Babbitt. We mentioned The Great Gatsby earlier. Ernest Hemingway will write several important novels. These authors, though, however, they're going to become somewhat disillusioned with America. They'll actually go to Paris to do most of their writing. And so this generation of not just writers, but but other artists as well. They're often called the lost generation because it's like maybe they themselves felt lost. They were disillusioned by what they had seen in World War One, but then they're also kind of lost to, they're not lost to America. Of course, we're reading their works here, but they're living and they're making their name in France. One of the most fun parts of this time period is music, is the jazz age. And when you think about New York City, the biggest city at the time and still today in the United States, we think of Harlem. Harlem is a neighborhood in Manhattan, and there will be the Harlem Renaissance. This came about because of the Great Migration, which we learned about earlier, where you had African Americans leaving the South and going to industrial cities in the North. A lot of them will settle in Harlem. Harlem is a Black neighborhood in Manhattan itself. There are several artists, poets, musicians, journalists, lawyers that are living in just this one neighborhood. The NAACP, who we talked about a couple of weeks ago, founded by W.B. Du Bois during this time, is headed by James Weldon Johnson, who is not only the head of the NAACP, but also a lawyer and a poet. So, like we said, Harlem is called often the capital of Black America. And if you ever go to New York City today, it's definitely a cool neighborhood to check out. When we think of the Renaissance, we often think of, right, the European Renaissance. But a Renaissance is just a renewal, a flowering, appreciation of maybe something that had already been there or something new as well. And so we really have this during the 1920s in Harlem. In terms of literature, we have Langston Hughes, who was the best known poet of the Harlem Renaissance and really of African American poetry in the early 1900s. His poems, not only does he write them to be read on a page, but to be read aloud, and he incorporates the pace and the pulse of jazz and blues music into his poems. Definitely worth checking out. Speaking of blues, we have Bessie Smith, who was called the Empress of the Blues. She's one of the first African American female singers who people, white or Black, will listen to on record. And we also famously have these jazz clubs in Harlem. One of them was the Cotton Club. You can see on here, check out how much it cost for dinner, $1.50. Sounds like a great deal to me. But the Cotton Club was a jazz club, and it's interesting. It's a jazz club in a Black neighborhood, but this is a segregated jazz club. It's only open to white patrons who are coming into this Black neighborhood to hear jazz played by Black musicians. So it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition there. Several different jazz artists played there. Duke Ellington. The screen shot there shows Cab Calloway, who's also definitely worth checking out. There are several other nightclubs at the time, which is the background of these images on your screen, that are integrated nightclubs. And so for the first time in American history, not counting the Cotton Club, but at all these other clubs, you have white and Black audiences mingling together, listening to and appreciating the same music. Louis Armstrong, who has a very recognizable singing voice, was a famous band leader and trumpeter during this time period. We mentioned Duke Ellington already. And we're going to do our acknowledgments now versus at the end, but I'd like to thank the following people for their input and their pictures that we saw so far. We'll continue on now and we'll see what was happening politically during this. Some of the big changes politically in the 1920s are revolving around the economy. As World War I had ended, as we mentioned before, the U.S. is having to adjust from wartime good production to the production of consumer goods, that guns versus butter production. Unions who had been prohibited from striking based on national security interests during the World War were able now to go on strike and are hoping to get better conditions. However, they're also accused of being communists at the time period, and we'll see why in just a little bit. And as we mentioned earlier, women and African Americans that previously had jobs in the manufacturing sector are having to find new jobs as they're displaced by returning GIs. The first president in the 1920s is Harding, and he'll campaign on a return to normalcy. So, what is that? What does that normalcy mean? We'll see in a little bit. As we mentioned with the failure to join the League of Nations last week, the United States didn't want to get involved in other countries' affairs. They were afraid of alliances and treaties sucking us into global conflicts. But there was also an increased nativism throughout the United States during this time period, this prejudice against people born in other places. We'll see how that played out in just a little bit. The first big fear that comes about during this time period is the first Red Scare. And as you remember, Russia left World War I when there was a communist takeover, when the Bolsheviks overthrew and executed the Tsar and his family. So back in America, there's this fear of a lot of things, but one of them is communism. And so the Attorney General named Mitchell Palmer gets evidence that communists are planning an uprising in 1920. And he conducts these raids where suspected communists are hunted, people's rights are somewhat abused as they look for communists rather unsuccessfully. Of note later on will be someone named J. Edgar Hoover. He'll be the head of the FBI. At this time, the FBI is not a thing yet, but he's a young person working for the Attorney General and bringing about this fear of a Red Scare. This Red Scare will be very short-lived, just 6 months, a year. The second Red Scare will be the one that we'll talk about after World War II that, of course, lasts much, much longer. Another place where we see nativism is in the arrest and apparent murder charges against two Italian American individuals. Their names are Sacco and Vanzetti. Not only are they Italian, they are anarchists as well. So that's something that scares a lot of Americans at the time. They're charged with robbery and murder, and they're convicted on fairly weak circumstantial evidence. Their trial garners national attention, and people really see this as a symptom of this increased nativism. A lot of people think that had they been from somewhere else, or had they been what people might have called a typical American at the time, we'll put that in air quotes, maybe they wouldn't have been convicted, but Sacco and Vanzetti nevertheless are. There was not only nationwide protests, but global protests against their execution. Sadly, during this time period, we have the second rise of the KKK, and there's some pretty scary statistics on this slide. So in 1924, there were 4.5 million members in the KKK, which was 4% of the American population. These are people who are still espousing their racist views from after the Civil War, but now they've added a whole host of other people to their list that they didn't like. So they were anti-immigrant, they were anti-union. They would often accuse unions of being communists. They were anti-Catholic, and they were anti-Jew, and they were also against alcohol. So you have this large group of things that they hate, which seems to be a large swath of the American population. But still, 4% of people, that's pretty scary. This picture is a parade down the streets of Washington, D.C., in 1924. So this was just 100 years ago when this kind of stuff was happening. Their membership will decline, thankfully, after the 1920s, but they'll have another resurgence in the 1950s. We mentioned nativism before. We see that again with limits on immigration. And there was fear for religious reasons, for ethnic reasons, but especially because people were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. We talked about this before, but these are groups that before had not come to the United States in large numbers. It's not really till the late 1890s when they start to come. So there will be a Quota Act that's placed in 1921, and then it'll be amended in 1924. And I want you to think about this math equation here for a second. What they're going to say is that for anybody from any country that wants to come to the United States in 1924, they're going to limit those applicants or those people admitted to 2% of how many people were already here from that country in 1890. So think about it. Why would they go 34 years back to find a baseline to decide who to admit to people in 1924? Well, the reason why is because in 1890, the year they're basing that off on, that was before Southern and Eastern European migration had really even started in the first place. So this shows the before the quotas and the after the quotas. If you look at, you see those huge drops there in Italian and Polish immigration, right? In people from Hungary, from Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. So those are Southern and Eastern European nations. And again, they went back to 1890 to make that baseline because there really was nobody coming in 1890 from those countries. So this is kind of a sneaky way where lawmakers could say they're fairly right limiting to 2% of any country that wants to come to the US. But of course, what's 2% of nothing? Well, it's nothing. Back to Harding. Harding is known for mainly scandal more than anything else. So there was a lot of corruption that was going on during his tenure. We'll get to the big one, which was the Teapot Dome scandal. So Teapot Dome is a mountain that's in Wyoming, and you see this picture. Maybe it looks like Cinderella's castle, but it's the actual geological feature that's there. And what was happening was the U.S. at the time was realizing that oil was key to fueling really our Navy ships at the time, and we're about to get into automobiles being manufactured. So the government had set aside this land, this oil in Teapot Dome for basically exclusive use for the U.S. Navy. However, Harding's Secretary of the Interior, named Albert Fall, is going to, I don't know how he thinks of this, but he thinks he's going to secretly let oil companies drill for oil on government land. And they're going to take most of that oil. They'll get some of it to the government. And in exchange, Albert Fall is going to get this kickback of almost $500,000. How do you secretly drill for oil, right? People like literally notice, hey, there's oil drilling machinery showing up here. What's going on? So he's exposed. Harding has not just Albert Fall, but a whole host of other people in his cabinet that are fairly shady people. They're called the Ohio Gang. That's where he's from, and it really reflects poorly on Harding as the president. He himself had his own scandal where he had a child out of wedlock just a couple of years before he ran for president. And a lot of Harding's secrets are starting to come to light when he actually dies coming back from a presidential trip to Alaska. So perhaps for Harding, maybe he checked out at the right time before his reputation could be even further scandalized. So moving on. Okay, well, we'll obviously have another president since the last one died, and that's Calvin Coolidge. So check out this quote from Calvin Coolidge. I think we can determine what he wants to prioritize most, and that is business. The Roaring '20s was a time of the economy booming for most people in America. Not everybody, but most. A part of that boom was automobile manufacturing. So the Model T, check that out. I don't know if you can see the price in there, but it's like $300 for a Model T. Henry Ford is going to take the assembly line, which had already been invented, but he's going to apply it to car manufacturing. And he's going to be able to turn cars from something that were a plaything for the rich to something that's affordable for everyday Americans. He's going to be wildly successful with this. 80% of all the cars in the world in the 1920s were made in America, which is pretty unique, right? Cars will change society tremendously, not the least of which was the fact that people could now live in one place and work in another place. You didn't have to live within walking distance of work, right? You could, or even What if you didn't live where there was a streetcar or a trolley that could take you to work? You could live further out. So we'll skip the beginning of cities themselves enlarging as people are able to get around more easily. The American standard of living is going to soar. 40% of the world's wealth is just in the United States. Think about how large the world is, right? And for 40% of it to be in the US really shows how successful we were. The average annual income of people will increase about a third during this time. They'll have more discretionary income. They'll do things like we talked about in the first half. They'll go to baseball games. We'll have amusement parks. The first roller coasters are built during this time period. Places like Coney Island and the Santa Cruz Boardwalk in California, all of those places become destinations for people with this extra money to spend. So it looks like things are going pretty well, right? People have all this money, they're spending it, they're out having fun, they're listening to jazz, they're buying new radios and cars. Things are good, but we're going to have some problems, right? Things, they're not always going to go up. What goes up will eventually come down. Our wages are looking good, our production, the gross national product, they're all rising, but there are going to be some problems on the horizon. Businesses will start to expand too much. They'll become reckless. Think about maybe a new business that you've seen that came to town and it only lasted a year or so because they overexpanded. The iron industry, which had fueled railroad growth, they're going to start to shrink as not just cars, but trucks, right, become a way to move goods around. Railroads will start to falter. Farms have been producing tremendously during the late 1800s into the early 1900s. During World War I, we're not only supplying our own needs, but we're supplying European countries that were at war with food. Well, what happens when that demand goes down, but that supply is still really high? People were expecting their incomes to go up and they were starting to buy things on credit or buying on margin, both goods and even stocks, thinking that, right, things will only get better. Let me buy some stock now for $10 because it'll be worth $15 a year from now. What if I have to borrow money to do that? That's okay because I'll get that back when the stock goes up. What if it doesn't go up, right? You can begin to see that some issues are creeping up. And we'll see what those issues are next time. Thank you again for watching. I appreciate it. Take care.